The black between systems does not hold secrets. It merely outlasts the men who tell them. For 7 months, 47 separate long-range military arrays had swept the sector mouth and reported absolutely nothing. The screens on those scout ships stayed dark. Their tracking software ran its routine loops, found only the cold push of solar dust, and cleared the logs. The crews drank their tea, looked at the charts, and believed the emptiness. They did not notice the small flutter in the background radiation every time the third moon turned. They had no idea that a single unseen human ship had spent 211 days, tracking 3 full Imperial fleets. The tiny bridge of the Vanguard asset did not look like the command center of a sector threat. It was 5 paces from the rear bulkheads to the main console. The air smelled of recycled copper and the dry mineral bite of ion-filtered screens. Commander Lyra Vance sat perfectly straight in her harness. Her hands rested flat against the composite edge of her desk. She did not shift her weight when the long-range sensors picked up the new alignment from the Valari Shard flagship. The temperature of our rations matches the silence of our grid. Vance did not speak the thought aloud. She reached out and touched a small cylinder of cold, synthetic water on the console. Her fingers held the smooth plastic without moving it. The condensation against her skin was freezing, a sharp needle of cold that kept her eyes locked on the tactical grid. Across from her, Sensor Tech Jackson kept his right thumb moving against his console. His thumb clicked against the plastic housing every 4 seconds. It was a rhythmic, dry sound that everyone on the bridge had learned to ignore over the last 20 weeks. His screen showed the Valari fleet shifting into a wide wedge. "The Valari flagship just altered its course by 4 degrees, Jackson said. His voice was flat, dried out by months of breathing the same thin air. "They are clearing their forward launch tubes. Their heavy cruiser is dropping behind the line to mask its power draw. They are getting ready to strike," Communications Officer Talia said. She cleared her throat, her voice small. "The Thavin border arrays are still pointing toward the inner cluster. They do not see the wedge forming. They will see it when the first plasma line cuts their dock," gunnery specialist Dane muttered. He cracked his wrist joints one by one. The loud pops sounded like small gravel hitting a bulkhead. "The Valari are 30 minutes from the drop point. If we stay under the shield, we watch them burn the Reach." Vance watched the white dots on her display. The 3 fleets were 3 separate empires, all drawing lines across the thin ribbon of space known as the Zephyr Reach. It was a narrow chokepoint that held half the trade capability of the quadrant. Whoever held the Reach held the throat of the sector. For 2 years, the empires had signed papers, made declarations, and promised peace. For 7 months, they had hidden their ships behind gas clouds and moons, waiting for the other side to drop their guard. "Dane," Vance said. Her voice was quiet, completely level. "Take us off the dead state. Drop the cloaking field." Jackson's thumb stopped mid-click. The silence on the bridge became heavy. "Commander," Dane asked, his hand hovering over the power array. "If we drop the shield now, we are 11,000 kilometers from their main bridge. They have 64 active interceptors in the air. We are a target." "Drop the shield," Vance repeated. She did not look up from the white dots. "And prepare the transmission." The Vanguard asset did not move. It simply became real. The space around the hull rippled once as the heavy cooling arrays stopped sucking the ship's heat into the storage cells. The long-range cloak died. To the Imperial arrays 11,000 kilometers away, a human vessel had just appeared out of absolute nothingness, sitting directly inside their secure command perimeter. "Would you have stayed, or would you have run? Because she didn't run. You'll want to hear how this ends. Trust me on that. Stay close." On the Valari flagship, the alarm lines would be flashing red. Vance could see the sudden panic on her passive sensors. The wide wedge of Imperial ships broke its pattern. 3 heavy cruisers began to turn their main arrays toward the human ship, their targeting systems trying to lock onto a hull that had no spacefold trail. They did not fire. The sheer impossibility of the Vanguard's position froze their command loop. A ship that could sit in their shadow for 7 months without a single sensor beep was a ship they did not understand. "They are trying to paint us with their tracking beams," Jackson said. His thumb started clicking again, faster now. "They can't get a solid lock. Our skin is still cold." "They won't fire yet," Vance said. She picked up the cold water cylinder, feeling the ice against her palm. "Vane is a bureaucrat. He doesn't pull a trigger until he knows who is paying for the metal." A sharp chime cut through the bridge air. The main screen split, replacing the tactical grid with a heavy, close-up feed of a Valari elite. Fleet Director Kalen Vane looked older than his official military files suggested. His six-eyed face was rigid, the chitinous plates around his jaw twitching with a slow, geometric anger. The massive biological chest plating that marked his high caste rose and fell in heavy ridges. On his primary appendage, 3 physical scale rings glinted under the harsh blue light of his own bridge. He did not look like a man who had been caught by surprise. He looked like a man whose account books had been miscalculated. "Unknown vessel," Vane said. The translation software on the Vanguard console converted his clicks into a low, rumbling English. "You are sitting inside a restricted military corridor during an active state of operational enforcement. State your authority or your hull will be reduced to scrap." Vance did not lean back. She did not blink. "My authority is the log you ran on day 104, Director. The one where you authorized the 3 resource transports to change their markings and enter the Thavan sector under a false medical flag." Vane's primary appendage froze. The scale rings stopped moving against his armor. On his bridge, the faint murmur of side characters and tactical officers died instantly. A clerk in the background who had been adjusting a data slate stopped his hand midair, his large eyes widening as he looked at his director's back. "You are throwing wild words into the air to save your life," Vane said. His voice dropped an octave, the translation software smoothing the edges into a hard, threatening whisper. "The Shard faction does not negotiate with stray scouts." "We are not out here to salvage your empires," Vance said. "We are simply mapping the cleanup. Talia, release the packet." "Packet is live," Talia said. Her fingers tapped 3 small switches on the lower tier of her desk. "Broadcasting now." The transmission did not go to the flagship. It did not go to the Valari command loop. The Vanguard's high-output arrays fired the data into every open commercial relay, every civilian transport node, and every automated trade beacon within 3 sectors. It was a massive, unfiltered data drop. 94 terabytes of raw, decrypted communications began to flood the sector's loops. It was not a summary. It was not a list of accusations. It was the actual voices of the 3 regional leaders, recorded over 211 days of secret meetings. It held the backroom agreements to split the trade routes. It held the unvoted tax charters they had hidden from their own assemblies. It held the precise coordinates, where the Thavan court had agreed to let the Valari strike their own outlying colonies to create a reason for war. Vance watched her screen as the data mirrored across the sector. "The trade councils have officially captured the archive," she said to the silent screen. "The confrontation is no longer localized, Director. Your home market is reading your logistics logs right now." Vane's lower eyes twitched. He turned his head slightly, looking at someone off-screen on his own bridge. The absolute silence from his side characters told the story. No one was dropping their stylus. No one was shifting their feet. They were all watching their individual displays as the private networks of their faction began to light up with messages from their capital worlds. "This is a fabrication," Vane said, but his voice lacked the heavy rumble from before. His massive chest plating stayed flat. "A human trick. The council will reject it." "We did the math while you were busy staging your banners," Vance told him. She set the cold water cylinder back on the metal console. The small ring of moisture it left behind was perfectly round. "Every signature is verified by your own internal encryption keys. You gave us the keys on day 42, when your communications ship forgot to cycle its routing tables after the nebula crossing. On the tactical grid, the white dots that represented the other two fleets began to slow down. The Thavan advance guard, which had been moving toward its defensive positions, halted entirely. Their command elements were receiving the same data. They were reading the exact terms of their own betrayal, written in the private hand of their own prime minister. "They are breaking formation," Jackson whispered. His thumb remained still against his console. "The Thavan ships are pulling back their targeting arrays from the outer ring. They are turning their sensors toward the Valari line." "They just realized they were walking into a setup," Dane said. A small, grim smile touched the corner of his mouth. "The whole sector just changed its mind." Vane looked back at the camera. His 6 eyes were wide, tracking the small numbers that were scrolling across the bottom of his own command display. The public transmitter on his flagship was receiving millions of pings every second from civilian trade blocks, demanding an immediate halt to the fleet's movement. The strategic superiority he had claimed 5 minutes ago had evaporated. "You have broken the law of the corridor," Vane said. His words were slow, heavy with the weight of a man who knew his career was ending before the first shot could be fired. "The galaxy had forgotten how to look for the things that do not seek attention," Vance said. "We are going to sit right here, Director. If you want to fire, your tracking system is working now, but I think you have some calls to answer first." Vane did not answer. He reached out with his secondary appendage and killed the link. The main screen on the Vanguard bridge went black, returning to the simple tactical grid of the Zephyr Reach. The white dots were no longer moving in a wedge. They were drifting, isolated and confused, inside a space that was no longer theirs to take. Vance took one slow breath. The cold air inside the bridge felt clean. She reached for her water cylinder, her fingers tracing the frozen condensation. The first movement was done, but the Reach was still full of ships, and the silence was just beginning to settle. The silence on the bridge lasted until the tactical grid updated again. The Valari cruisers were backing off, their giant thrust nozzles turning to point toward the outer rim. The wedge was gone, replaced by a loose cloud of ships that were no longer trying to look like a weapon. They looked like a crowd waiting for an elevator. Vance did not relax her stance. Her fingers left the cold plastic of her water container and hovered over the console. "Jackson, track the Thavan command ship. What are they doing with their secondary arrays?" "They are broadcasting to their capital," Jackson said. His thumb went back to its slow click against the plastic frame. "Not a secure link either. They are using an old civilian line. They want everyone to hear what they are saying to their ministers." "They are trying to look innocent," Dane said. He leaned over his weapon panel, his knuckles white against the metal casing. "They want the Trade Council to think they didn't know about the secret tax agreements. It's a scramble to protect their docks." The grid was clear, but the real weight of the day was still dropping through the sector. Across 40 systems, 3 billion people were currently logging into their local nodes to find their names already crossed off on a resource budget they had never voted on. Vance knew what those numbers looked like when they hit a real town. In the colony files for the Outer Reach, someone had gone through the registries one name at a time, the colony rolls, the orbital stations, and beside the total, an Imperial clerk had written a single word in ink: counted. Those names were no longer statistics. They were people who had spent their morning wondering if their food shipments would arrive, unaware that their lives had been traded away 3 months ago during a dinner on a flagship. "We have a second-tier transmission coming in," Talia said. Her hand was steady as she cleared her throat. "It's not from Vane. It's an automated handshake from Outpost Alpha 9. The Thavan governor wants to know if our archive contains the 3rd section of the Sunder Gap log." Vance kept her eyes on the display. "Tell them the archive is complete. We do not hold back sections to make friends." "They are desperate," Dane muttered. If the Sunder Gap data gets out, the Thavin court won't last the night. Their own guards will open the gates. The data is already out, Vance said. Her voice was thin, sharp like the edge of a fresh sheet of paper. They are just realizing how much of it we took. The ship hummed beneath her feet, a low vibration that came from the secondary cooling pumps. It was the only sound that belonged to the Vanguard. For 7 months, that hum had been their entire world. They had lived in the dark, turning off their heaters, eating cold nutrient paste from plastic tubes, and tracking the movements of men who didn't know they were being watched. They had seen the fleets arrive one by one, their banners bright and their public announcements full of promises about regional security. The galaxy had forgotten how to look for things that did not seek attention. It was an old mistake, the kind that empires made when they grew too large to look down at their own shadows. They measured power by the diameter of a plasma tube or the number of holes in a wedge. They didn't understand that a single ship with a cold skin and a long memory could do more damage than a kinetic strike. "Commander," Jackson said, his thumb stopping instantly. "The Valari flagship is cycling its main reactor again. They aren't preparing to jump." "Are they locking weapons?" Dane asked, his hand dropping to the manual fire trigger. "No," Jackson said. His eyes were wide as he looked at the sensor return. "They are dumping their waste heat directly into the corridor. They are trying to blind our passive infrared arrays." The main screen flared with a white, grainy haze as the massive thermal discharge from the Imperial flagship filled the thin space between the ships. The white dots on the tactical grid blurred, their edges running together like ink in water. It was a classic tactical move, a smoke screen built from high-temperature plasma. It wouldn't hide a ship for long, but it was enough to break a standard targeting loop for 3 minutes. "They think we are using standard thermal optics," Dane said, his voice rising a fraction. "They are trying to move while we are blind." "They aren't moving away," Vance said. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked through the white haze on her screen. "Vane is too proud to run under a cloud of his own garbage. He's repositioning his heavy scouts." "Why?" Talia asked. "He knows the data is already on the civilian nodes. Moving his ships won't delete the files." "He's not trying to delete the files," Vance said. Her hand went back to the cold water cylinder, her skin feeling the frost against her palm. "He's trying to find out where we were sitting before we dropped the shield. He wants to know if we have a second asset in the cluster." The ship gave a sudden, sharp jerk. It wasn't a hit, but the gravitational pull from the Valari flagship's main engine dump was dragging at the Vanguard's cold hull. The light on the bridge flickered twice, dropping from 12 lumens down to a faint, dark orange. The copper smell in the air became stronger as the emergency scrubbers kicked in to handle the ambient heat from the corridor. "Sensor lock broken," Jackson reported. His voice was tense now, the rhythmic clicking of his thumb replaced by a rapid tap against the metal desk. "We are losing the outer ring signatures. The Thavin fleet is completely gone from the display." "Dane, do not cycle the active arrays," Vance ordered. Her voice remained perfectly level, an anchor in the orange darkness of the bridge. "If you turn on the radar, they will trace the line straight to our bridge. We stay quiet." "We are sitting in their exhaust," Dane said. His arm was tense as he held the manual trigger. "If one of their scouts drifts into our sector, they will hit us before we can clear the tubes." "They won't drift," Vance said. "They are searching the area where they thought a human scout would hide. They are looking near the moon." She checked the internal clock. It had been 7 minutes since the data drop went live. The first civilian protests would be forming on the trade docks of the Valari capital. The regional markets would be freezing their accounts, and the colonial governors would be checking the seals on their defensive grids. The war hadn't started, but the structure that supported it was already cracking under the weight of its own exposed secrets. "I have a new signal," Talia said. She leaned toward her terminal, her headset pressed tight against her ear. "It's a tight beam transmission from the inner system. It's bypass-coded. It's using our old department registry. Vance turned her head. Source. It's not a ship, Talia said. Her face looked white under the orange emergency lights. It's an automated dead man switch from Outpost Alpha 9, the human monitoring station on the ridge. Commander, the station went off the air 4 minutes ago. The bridge became completely still. Outpost Alpha 9 was their only relay point back to Sector Core Intelligence. It was a 3-man listening post hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid on the edge of the Reach. It had no weapons, no heavy shields, and no strategic value to an Imperial fleet. It was just a small room with a large transmitter, designed to send the Vanguard's data back to the human territory if the ship was lost. Did the Valari hit them? Dane asked. His voice was thick with an old anger. The log doesn't show an explosion, Talia said. She looked down at the scrolling text on her small terminal. The connection didn't snap. It was closed from the inside. The operator used the formal departure code before the grid died. Vance did not answer immediately. She reached down and picked up the cold water cylinder, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the Thavan fleet had been 3 minutes ago. The outpost wouldn't close its own grid unless the room was being cleared, or unless they had received an order that didn't come through the Vanguard's channel. Jackson, Vance said, the thermal haze is clearing. Give me the primary signatures. The white blur on the screen began to break up as the plasma expanded into the vacuum. The tactical grid returned, line by line. The Valari flagship was still there, its massive chitinous hull sitting motionless in the center of the corridor. The Thavan fleet had pulled back by 20,000 kilometers, their ships forming a tight defensive circle around their own supply line. But there was a third signature on the edge of the display, a small gray dot that had not been there before the smoke screen. It was sitting at the exact coordinates where Outpost Alpha 9 used to be. It had no faction markings, no encryption signature, and no thermal trail. It was completely cold, just like the Vanguard. A second human vessel? Dane asked, his hand loosening slightly on the trigger. Did Core Intelligence send a backup? No, Vance said. Her eyes were fixed on the gray dot. She could feel the cold from the cylinder moving up her arm, a sharp reminder of how long they had been out here alone. Core didn't send a backup. They don't have another ship with this grade of cloak within 3 weeks of this sector. The gray dot on the screen began to move. It wasn't turning toward the Imperial fleets, and it wasn't trying to hide behind the moon. It was moving straight toward the Vanguard asset, its speed increasing with every second as it crossed the narrow choke point of the Reach. They are broadcasting an old human naval identifier, Talia whispered. She did not clear her throat this time. Her voice was flat, empty of expression. It's a registry number that was retired 40 years ago, before the first trade treaty was signed. Vance watched the dot cross the 10,000-kilometer line. The open loop she had built with the data drop was supposed to force the empires to talk to each other. It was supposed to create a neutral council, a clean space where the math would settle the dispute before the guns could start. But the gray ship on her screen wasn't part of the math. It was something else, an old ghost from the era before the Cold War had names, and it was moving with a purpose that none of their logs had predicted. Commander, Jackson said, his thumb tapping twice against the console before stopping completely. The Valari flagship is turning its main arrays again. They aren't looking at us anymore. They see the gray ship too. Vance stood up from her harness for the first time in 7 hours. She did not shift her weight as she looked at the screen. The silence on the bridge was gone, replaced by the rapid click of the incoming naval handshake from a vessel that wasn't supposed to exist. Talia, Vance said, open the link. Let's see who is driving the ghost. The old naval handshake clicked 3 times before the audio channel hissed to life. It did not carry a voice. Instead, the console printed out a series of raw coordinates in a block of old military text that had not been used since Vance was a child. The numbers pointed to a dark patch of space behind the Vanguard's own cooling vents, an orientation that meant the gray ghost was already sliding into their defensive blind spot. "He's matching our velocity exactly," Jackson said, his fingers frozen over the console. "No active tracking, no engine flare. If I didn't see the gray block on the visual feed, I would say there's nothing out there but cold gas." "The Valari flagship is moving," Dane warned. He didn't pop his wrist joints this time. His arms stayed locked against the manual weapon control. "They aren't firing at the ghost. They are pulling their forward cruisers back into a tight box. Vane is scared." Vance did not return to her harness. She stood by the primary display, her boots planted firm against the floor plates. Vane isn't scared of the ship. He's scared of what the ship means. "Talia, did the signal from Alpha 9 leave any secondary trace before it went dark?" Talia shook her head, her hand adjusting her headset. "Nothing but the departure code, Commander. But the transmission didn't go to core intelligence. It was redirected to the gray hull." A new line of text scrolled across the central screen, rewriting the old naval identifier. It was an English phrase, short and plain, appearing one word at a time. "The ledger is open." "The ledger," Vance repeated. A cold prickle of recognition moved down her neck. She reached back toward the console, her fingers finding the smooth edge of the cold water cylinder without looking at it. The condensation had stopped freezing. It was running down the plastic in long, slow tears. She remembered an old file from the first days of her training, a rumor about a group of deep space assets that had stayed in the black when the borders were drawn. They weren't reconnaissance ships. They were auditors, vessels built to ensure that if a sector went down, no one left with a clean slate. "Commander," Jackson whispered, his voice dropping low. "The gray ship just dropped a drone. It's not an explosive. It's an old-style data buoy, and it's drifting right toward our launch bay." "Do we take it?" Dane asked, his thumb hovering over the intake release. "It could hold a logic bomb. If it touches our primary grid, it could wipe the 94 terabytes we just seeded." "Take it," Vance said. Her voice was flat, empty of doubt. "If they wanted to wipe our grid, they wouldn't have used a buoy. They would have used the handshake." The ship gave a faint clunk as the launch bay doors caught the drifting metal. For a long minute, the only sound on the bridge was the steady hum of the emergency scrubbers. Then, the main tactical display flickered. The white dots of the 3 Imperial fleets didn't move, but a secondary layer of information appeared over them, tinted in a dull, rusted iron color. Vance looked at the new data, and her hands went still. The 94 terabytes they had released were only the first half of the record. The buoy held the second half, the logistics logs from the civilian trade councils themselves. It showed that the merchants hadn't just been cheated by their governors, they had been helping them. The trade blocs had been funding the fleet deployments for months, using fake grain shortages to drive up the prices on the outer stations, while the military units took their positions. "It's a circle," Dane said, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "The whole sector wasn't falling into a war, they were selling it." "L1 personal security is gone," Vance said, her eyes tracking the lines of wealth moving between the systems. "L2 relational trust between the factions is dead. This is L3 existential collapse. If this data goes wide, there won't be a trade council left to form a neutral assembly. The stations will starve before the first month ends, because no one will accept their credits." "Then we don't broadcast it," Talia said, her hand hovering over the block switch. "We keep the second half locked." "We can't," Jackson said. He pointed to the gray dot on his screen. "The Ghost didn't just give it to us. They are already linking to the main commercial relays. Look at the data rates." The gray ship had opened its main transmission arrays. It wasn't using the Vanguard's careful, hidden routing. It was hammering the sector's trade loops with an unencrypted signal that was burning through the Valari smoke screen by sheer power output. The civilian nodes weren't just reading logs now. They were watching their own banks go dark, as the automated credit registries began to reject every transaction from the three faction capitals. This was the cliff. The tactical standoff between three fleets had just turned into a structural rot that was eating the entire corridor from the inside out. Vance reached for the water cylinder, her thumbs smoothing a drop of moisture against the label. She didn't look at the tactical grid. She looked at Jackson, whose hand had finally stopped its rhythmic tapping against his desk. "Jackson," Vance said quietly, "open the old emergency frequency, the one we used before the solstice." "The fleet directors won't be on that line, Commander," Jackson said. "That's a human military channel." "They will be on it if they want to survive the afternoon," Vance said. "Because right now, none of their ships have a way to pay for their fuel." A sharp, high-pitched tone cut through the bridge air, louder than any of the previous chimes. It didn't come from the gray ship, and it didn't come from the Valari flagship. The sound was localized, vibrating through the bulkheads of the Vanguard itself, coming from the low storage compartments beneath their feet. "What is that?" Dane asked, his hand snapping back to his weapons panel. "Did we take a hit from the buoy?" "No," Jackson said, his face turning gray under the orange light. "The buoy is dead in the bay. The sound is coming from our secondary cooling cells, the ones we used to keep the cloak running for 7 months." The automated temperature display on the central console began to drop, its green lines turning into a hard, bright blue. The ship wasn't heating up from the Valari plasma dump. It was freezing from the inside. The synthetic water inside Vance's cylinder turned solid in her hand with a faint, cracking sound, the plastic splitting down the side as the ice expanded. Vance looked at the cracked cylinder. She didn't drop it. The character-hidden layer she had maintained through the long vigil, the absolute insistence on zero radiation protocol, the low lights, the 5-syllable phrases, hadn't been designed to hide them from the Valari scouts. She had known from day one that the Empires weren't the only ones watching the Reach. "They aren't trying to help us," Vance said, her voice dropping into a low, conversational tone that sounded entirely ordinary against the rising alarm. "The auditors don't care about a neutral council. They came to clear the ledger." The gray dot on the tactical grid stopped its advance. It sat 5,000 kilometers away, perfectly cold, its transmission array still burning through the sector's loops. On the visual feed, the outer skin of the ghost ship began to shift, its dull gray plating splitting open to reveal rows of small, dark tubes that were not designed for plasma or data. They were old-style kinetic rails, built to fire heavy blocks of tungsten that didn't care about shielding or electronic fields. "They are targeting the Valari flagship," Dane said. "They are targeting all of them," Vance corrected him. She set the broken cylinder on her console, the ice white and hard against the dark metal. "The fleets, the stations, and us. If the ledger is open, no one leaves the corridor." The kinetic rails on the gray ghost ship glinted under the distant light of the choke point. The long tubes did not warm up. They simply slid into position with a mechanical snap that carried no heat. On the tactical display, the gray ship's targeting lines split into 3 distinct paths, each one tracking the primary engine clusters of the Imperial forces. "The Valari flagship is charging its shields," Jackson said, his fingers tap-tapping against the frame of his desk. "But their grid is unstable. The credit collapse is shutting down their internal supply routing. Their engineers are locked out of their own fuel pumps." "They can't fight a ghost without their logs," Dane said. He took his hand off the manual trigger and looked at Vance. "And we can't run with our cooling cells frozen. We are a brick in the path." Vance stood by the display. The internal frost was creeping up the legs of her harness, painting the gray composite with fine, white needles. She didn't look at the cold hull outside. She leaned over her console and picked up a simple, plastic stylus, the ordinary tool she had used to log her daily shift data every 12 hours for 7 months. It was a cheap piece of administrative plastic, completely unimportant. She tapped the stylus against the open emergency frequency. "Director Vane," Vance said into the line. "Your flagship has 20 minutes of standby power before your automated security network locks your main reactor. The Thavan fleet has less. You are both waiting for a strike that will clear this corridor for good." The channel did not hiss. The translation software rumbled immediately with Vane's voice, but the clicks were short and jagged. "The human asset brought this curse to our sector. You released the archive." "We released the truth," Vance said. "The auditors brought the rails. If you want to clear your security lock, you need an administrative override from outside your faction networks. You need a clean ledger." "There is no clean ledger," Vane growled. "The markets are dead." "The trade councils are dead," Vance said, her voice dropping into a flat, steady drone. "The people are still there. On the outer stations, they are already organizing their own local distribution loops using the civilian transport logs we provided. They aren't waiting for your credits." She turned to Talia. "Link the Valari command grid directly to our primary database. Give them the administrative handshake we used during the first weeks of the surveillance." Talia's hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before she struck the switch. "Link is open. The Valari flagship is accepting the routing." This was the hidden layer Vance had held since the beginning of the vigil. The long months of zero radiation protocol hadn't just been an engineering choice to hide from the Imperial scouts. It had been the exact process required to sync the Vanguard's internal clock with the old naval registry of the Corps. She had known that if the records were ever exposed, the system would send an auditor. She had spent 211 days preparing the ship to look like part of the ledger itself. "The gray ship is adjusting its tracking," Jackson reported. His thumb was completely still now. "Their rails are turning. They aren't looking at the Valari flagship anymore." "Are they looking at us?" Dane asked. "No," Jackson said, his eyes wide. "They are looking at the connection. We just turned the two ships into a single network node. If they fire at Vane, they hit the human archive." The tactical grid flickered. The gray ghost did not fire its tungsten blocks. The long, dark tube stayed extended, but the gray dot stopped its approach, sitting motionless at 5,000 kilometers. The old naval handshake on the audio channel clicked once more, a single, sharp pop that sounded like a door closing in an empty house. On the Valari flagship, the six-eyed director looked down at his own screen. The administrative override from the Vanguard had bypassed his corrupted financial logs, returning the primary control of his engines to his manual bridge crew. He had his power back, but he no longer had a wedge. He was sitting in a line with his rivals, tied to a human scout ship by a thread of shared data that every civilian node in the sector could see. "The Thavan cruisers are dropping their shields," Talia said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper against the hum of the freezing pumps. "They are sending a general broadcast to our terminal. They are asking for the council parameters." "Give them the parameters," Vance said. She set the plastic stylus back in its slot on the console. "Tell them the assembly meets at Outpost Alpha 9 within 48 hours. The station is empty, but the tables are still there." The gray ghost ship began to back away. It did not use an engine fold. It simply slid backward into the dark patch behind the moon, its cold skin blending with the background radiation, until the gray block disappeared from the visual feed. The targeting lines died on the display, leaving only the loose cloud of Imperial hulls and the single white dot of the Vanguard asset. The standoff was over. The war had not manifested because the logistics had been exposed before the first banner could fall. The three empires were no longer regional conquerors. They were simply large, broke systems that needed to find a way to pay for their next shipment of grain. Vance sat back down in her harness. The ice on the console was starting to melt as the secondary cooling pumps returned to their standard routine, the green lines of the temperature display rising back toward the normal sector. She reached out and touched the broken cylinder of water. The plastic had split completely, and the ice inside was turning back into clear, cold liquid, dripping onto the gray metal deck in slow, rhythmic beats. "Jackson," Vance said, her voice tired but level. "Reset the passive arrays. Keep the log running." "The fleets are moving toward the outpost," Jackson said, his thumb starting its slow click against the plastic housing once again. "They are moving together." "Good," Vance said. "Pour another. The next sector hasn't realized the temperature has dropped yet." The corridor outside the port was dark and clear. The ships of the three factions drifted toward the ridge, their long lines silhouetted against the dim light of the gas cloud. There were no banners visible in the black, and no signals passed between the cruisers except the simple, unencrypted navigation markers provided by the human asset. The black between systems stayed silent, matching the deep, cold grid of the Reach.